You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. I'm Jill Waterman, the show's creative producer. I'm also host of our new monthly series, Picturing World Cultures. It's been said that the first generation of immigrants wants to survive, the second wants to assimilate, and the third wants to remember. While this exact timeline is no doubt variable, the general concept has recently turned a fascination with ancestry into an exploding trend. But what happens when exploring one's cultural heritage leads to putting down roots, then building a career documenting the sweeping cultural changes amid the growth of a global superpower? In today's show, we speak with a photographer who's done just that. Walking us through his adventures in this ever-shifting landscape is photographer Mark Leong, a fifth-generation Chinese-American born and raised in Sunnyvale, California. After graduating from Harvard University in 1988, Mark was awarded a year-long Gardner Travel Fellowship to photograph in his ancestral homeland. He returned to China in 1992 as an artist in residence at Beijing's Central Academy of Fine Art. He ultimately decided to relocate to Beijing long-term, where he lived until 2017. During that time, he had a front-row seat to the many changes in one of the world's most populous countries. In 2003, Mark joined the photo agency Redux Pictures. His book China Obscura was published in 2004. A contributing photographer for National Geographic, Mark's photos have appeared in many other major publications. He's also received support from the NEA, 50 Crows, the Overseas Press Club, the Open Society, and most recently, Center's Blue Earth Fiscal Sponsorship Award. After many years in Beijing, Mark now lives in the San Francisco Bay Area, yet he continues his work on extended photo projects in China. Mark Leong, welcome to the show.
It's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's great to talk to you today. So I should preface our conversation by mentioning that up until now, this series has generally featured photographers who document within their country of origin or native culture. While you're ethnically Chinese, you were born and raised in America, yet you've dedicated much of your photographic career to living in China and focusing on Asia in your work. I specifically wanted to speak with you about China because of the dramatic timing of your arrival in 1989 and your current focus on the young adults born under China's one-child policy, which we'll get into later. But first, I have to ask, you refer to your heritage as fifth-generation Chinese, which is on your father's side, but your maternal grandfather emigrated to America in the 1920s, making you third generation on your mother's side. What, if anything, does that two-generation difference mean to you?
I always talk about myself as fifth generation because I'm proud of the amount of time my family has been in America. It's over 100 years. And just thinking about the historical things they were involved in, like the building of the railroad, and then like having been here before the China Exclusion Act, that's kind of interesting for me to understand their part in what went on in California and what went on in the American West. And then it's interesting because my kids who are in their teens and 20s, they actually go the other way because I was trying to assimilate into suburban life in California, which was mostly white at the time when I was growing up. And they are more interested in their identity as something different and something unique. And so for them, Chinese is more important. So they would emphasize that side of their family.
Right. And multiculturalism and all
And that's
that.
just a new thing. I think just to be unique and different or to just be aware of your identity is more important for young people than it was for me at the time.
Yeah. Interesting. So you have childhood memories of your maternal grandfather's visits to California, which you wrote about in your book, China Obscura. What did this tangible connection to your family's Chinese heritage mean to you as you were a young kid growing up in mid-century American culture?
Well, because I was in that kind of assimilation mode, it annoyed me when it was happening. I felt
Mm,
that I didn't want to go to this place where I didn't speak the language and everything felt foreign to me. I grew up in Sunnyvale with malls and paper route and soccer practice. And then I go to this place where it just seems alien. That said, it did remind me that I was Chinese. And so even though I didn't enjoy it, it hardwired that link
yeah.
to where we came from. Over time, I've come to appreciate it. Yeah.
Mhm, mhm. Do you think that tangible connection was part of the reason why you focused some time on documenting American Chinatowns when you were in college?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I thought this was a strange place. And it was a visual place. There's also that aspect. There was a visual part of my life and who I was. And I did realize that to enrich my current experience at the time, I should understand who I could have been. And so I went back to that. I said, well, this is someplace it's part of me. I don't understand it.
Mhm.
Let's engage it with my camera.
Yeah. So how many cities did you photograph the American Chinatowns for?
I think it was like 10 cities across North America.
How varied were they? At that time in the 1980s, it must have been quite different than, the Chinatowns that you find today.
There were some classic old Chinatowns like San Francisco and New York,
Mhm.
just felt well embedded neighborhoods.
Mhm.
And then other places where it was maybe just like a Chinese gate and a few restaurants.
Mhm.
That was my first long term project I did. And so I wasn't thinking anthropologically. I was just trying to get pictures. I was like, oh, here's an interesting environment to take pictures in. It's related to who I am. I recognize some parts of these places, like these kind of markets or these kinds of signs, but I didn't even read Chinese words at that time.
Mm.
I was just kind of experiencing it, just going out there, walking the streets, not really making contact with the people. It was kind of intimidating. It's the first project I had done.
That's sort of where everybody starts is a little bit, hesitant but was that project part of the reason you got the travel grant to go to China?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
And also, that was part of my proposal
Mm.
when I applied for the grant to go to actual China. I said, well, this is my first step because it was. It was like the opposite of immigration into America. Chinatown for people coming to America is a place people stop off on the way to moving out, spreading themselves around different parts of the
Mhm.
country. And for me, it was the first waypoint on the way out.
Yeah.
It came to me probably about halfway through when I was photographing for that 1 year of the Chinatowns.
Mm.
So I said, I should probably go back and see China itself at this point.
Mhm. So you received the travel fellowship, but the timing of your arrival was quite dramatic. You actually arrived in China the day after the Tiananmen Square crackdown in 1989. And that was such a historic moment globally. Did it feel at all like you were starting your documentation from ground zero because of the consequences of that event?
I felt the vent and I felt the kind of cloud it had over China and what I was photographing. It seemed to be a very down time, especially when I went to cities in China.
Mm.
But I did not think of it as ground zero because I had no comparison to base on it. It was more like my ground zero that happened to coincide with this event. There was no change or anything like
Mhm.
that to me because that's all I knew of China.
Right.
It felt like to me that not only had it been that way for a long time, it would always be that way. And both of those things are wrong.
Mhm. So, as we mentioned, you're ethnically Chinese, but you describe yourself as an outsider who came with a preconceived notion of Chinese people as a monolithic block of conformity. How did you go about shedding those preconceptions in your early days there?
I guess I kind of bought into the Western feeling that Asians and Chinese were all very similar. Even though I knew better,
Mhm.
when I first got there, my language was not great. It's still not great,
Mhm.
but my language was very, very poor in terms of speaking Chinese. And so I would just look at people. I was like, wow, there's so much variety in this crowd of people. because I'm a photographer. I'm looking at their faces and thinking, how am I going to photograph them? Saying, oh, this is different. This is different. All these people are so different. And then as I started learning the language and making friends, I found that in the same way that any big group of people has so many different possibilities and characteristics,
Hmm.
it's just a matter of getting to know people, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So in that early time that you were there, you made a visit to your grandfather's native village. When exactly was that, and how significant was it in shaping your outlook?
The first time I went was during my first year-long trip to China in 1990,
Hmm.
and that was for Chinese New Year, because that's kind of a traditional time to go back.
Exactly, yeah.
I had an uncle in Chicago, and he still had contact with the village. So he wrote like a letter for me, and it felt like a ceremonial letter because it was written on red paper and it was written vertically in Chinese characters. And I kept it like in a Ziploc bag, and I showed it to a bunch of guys on motorcycles because in those days that was a taxi. One of the guys said, "Oh, I know where that village is," because I think it said on the note, "I am the son of my grandfather, and I want to go to this village." That was my intro letter to the village. So when I got there, it was cool because once I showed this letter, I was welcomed like I had always been there. I was like a returning brother.
Mm,
I barely spoke the language. And I certainly didn't speak the local dialect. Like I was learning Mandarin and they were speaking the Toisan dialect. So I had to speak with one of the younger people there,
mhm,
like my cousin who spoke Mandarin.
mm,
Later on during the trip, we went on bicycles like a mile away from our village to another village. And then my cousin brought me into this kind of dark, dusty house. And there was this old woman there, and my eyes are adjusting to the darkness in the room. And I look on the wall, all these photos, and one of them was my uncle in Chicago. It was not really my close uncle, but there were also pictures of my aunts and cousins who were very close, also from Chicago. And there's all these snapshots of these people. This old woman who I have no idea who she is, sitting in the corner, and then the wall is covered with people I know.
mhm.
I thought, oh, this is, I guess, where we come from. Like this physical evidence that I belonged.
Right, right. And there was mail correspondence.
Yeah, exactly. Later on, I saw those kind of address labels because they couldn't write English. So they would send back address labels from America.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Huh. So, what kind of effects did the fact that you didn't speak Chinese at first have on your access and your ability to photograph?
Well, when I first went back, I was mostly shooting on the street. Access was not a big deal. Just by being friendly, by being harmless, even without great language, people were accepting of me taking photos.
Hmm.
But it still kind of hinders my understanding of what I'm photographing. Sometimes I photograph stuff or see something that's interesting and think maybe later on I'll ask somebody what I actually photographed. Photograph first and ask questions later.
Uh-huh.
Right.
Did you ever run into situations where the lack of language ability let you in to photograph things that other people might not permit?
It's hard for me to know because of the lack of language ability. I do know that sometimes I'd be working with a journalist who was like a friend who was white but spoke much better Chinese than I would. It'd be like an interview of somebody, and the journalist would do the interview, and then afterwards, the person being interviewed would come to me and say, "Okay, just between us Chinese, I can tell you this extra detail.
Uh-huh.
You know, you're one of us,
Right.
regardless of your cultural ability or understanding or language ability. You're one of us."
Yeah. That's cool.
Yeah.
So, what about cultural differences between city dwellers and people in smaller villages? Was there a big difference in your early days there?
In my early days, I pretty much stuck to the countryside because the cities, this was after Tiananmen, were more nervous.
Mhm.
And so I didn't have a real basis for comparisons because China is quite varied and large. And so all my initial ideas about how China was were formed by what I saw in the countryside. It's also like everything's dynamic. China's going through this moment. I am going through my initial development as a lone photographer, working by myself in a place I don't understand. I was just trying to go along with the flow as opposed to making comparisons at that point.
Hmm. Well, what about you went back to the States for 2 or 3 years and then you returned in 1992? What kind of differences did you find when you went back the second time after the 2 to 3 years you were away?
So that's interesting because instead of going to the countryside, I went to Beijing. And also, I'm going to the art school. So this is like a very specialized group of cultured people who are watching videotapes of French films and stuff like that. So it's very different. It seemed like a whole different place. And then things were opening up. So, like when I first got to China, there were no supermarkets. You had to kind of go to the counter. And if you wanted something, like if you wanted to buy a deck of cards, you had to fill out a little form. You go to another counter, you'd pay cash, you get another form back, you bring the form to the original counter, they give you the cards. That was still the case when I was there in Beijing, but it was changing. And they're starting to have these places that were kind of self-serve stores,
Hmm.
like the first grocery stores where you just
Yeah.
could pick your stuff out. It wasn't a wet market. It wasn't this kind of bureaucratic place where you had to go to different counters. It was just a place you grab your stuff, put it in a basket, which we're used to in America.
Hmm.
And so that was different. And then the appearance of more imported products, like getting Oreo cookies. That was something that suddenly showed up, or Coca-Cola.
Hmm.
And because I remember when I was first there, I would go to stores and it'd be like one kind of biscuit or one kind of soda. It's like very, very few choices of anything. Kind of the consumer culture was ramping up the second time it came back. And then globalization, cultural globalization. I was with all these art students. And part of the way we bonded was we listened to the same music. Early 90s is Nirvana was happening.
Hmm.
And I don't know if you remember this rap band, Arrested Development. So we'd have these parties and we'd be playing this music and everybody would be getting into the same kind of songs. That was another way to bond. And that was not the case when I was in 1989. And I don't know if it was because I was not in the city or it was because the time difference. I think it was probably a little bit of both.
Hmm.
But, again, that was a time when there was so little choice. You'd hear the same song being played. I remember I was in a hostel and I was trying to go to sleep, and some played the same song probably like 40 times in a row, a Chinese popular song.
Hmm.
By the time I got to Beijing, it seemed like more variety and internationalization was happening.
Yeah, yeah. There were Western songs added to the playlist. You mentioned the word wet market, and that's a curious reference for me. What specifically is the description of a wet market?
I don't always call it a wet market. It's like a fresh food market where
Mm.
farmers and distributors come in and they sell stuff
Mhm.
from live chickens, live pigs, to eggs, to cabbages, and it's usually in season.
Right, right.
Um, I guess another change, people would pile up all their cabbage outside their house
Mhm.
because it was the only vegetable it seemed that was available in the winter. And it was very hardy, so it could just be in a pile outside your house and you just bring it inside, peel off the outside leaves, get the coal dust off it, and you could make it. And
Wow.
that changed when shipping got better and refrigeration got better. And so people could have all kinds of different vegetables throughout the year. But when I was first in Beijing, it was like everybody had these piles of cabbage. I think it was like November 1st when all the big trucks would come into town full of cabbages
Hmm.
and they just dump them on the street for somebody to sell. And people would just buy cartloads to bring to their house. And that would be their vegetable for the entire winter.
So, was there one particular point where you really noticed the rise in consumer culture?
That was probably it, probably the early 90s.
Mhm.
The cabbage mountains got smaller and smaller every year. Shops would open because at the time when I was there, I was also a consumer. So I was happy when a new kind of shampoo showed up,
Right.
that I like, or something I wanted, a different kind of bicycle. When I first got there, all the bicycles were black and the same, like
Mhm.
two brands of bicycles, they were all black, one-speed bicycles. And then some blue bicycles started appearing, red bicycles started appearing. And that was just kind of nice. I guess visually, because I'm also thinking visually, I'm also a photographer.
Right.
Computers started appearing. But yeah, mostly at shops. I think when I was first there, the first private enterprises were actually barber shops or a place to get your hair cut.
Mhm. That were inside rather than on the street.
Yes, they were
Yeah.
inside. The old barbershops were government. And so the people would all wear these kind of white coats like they're in a lab.
Mhm.
And it didn't seem like that fashionable. And then later on, especially in the South, because when I first got to China, I went to my ancestral province, Guangdong, which is in the South. And that's also where free enterprise started in China. And I think the cutting edge of free enterprise was a place to cut your hair.
Interesting. So, obviously, in the early 90s, your earliest Chinese pictures were shot on film. What kind of gear were you working with back then? And when did you make a switch from film to digital?
So I've always shot Nikons, and that's just
Mm.
because I think my first camera was Nikon, and I never wanted to go and switch all my lenses. So
Mhm.
I shot FE, FM2, F3, all kinds of Nikon film cameras.
Mhm.
Um, and one of the interesting things about being in China at that time was you couldn't buy film that was any good. I knew this was going to be the case. And so I hand rolled like 300 rolls of film,
Mm.
which seems like a lot then, but not these days, not with digital. But then it felt like a lot of pictures.
Right.
I think I was shooting T-Max 400 and T-Max 3200. And so I hand rolled all my T-Max 400. I don't think I hand rolled the 3200. And I just carried it across the border.
Mm.
And that was also freaky for the border guards because they'd never seen somebody carry so much film. They said, "You must be a spy."
Right.
They said, "There's no way you can use all this film." I remember I had the big bag of film and maybe 100 rolls because I would go back to Hong Kong every so often to re-up my supply of stuff
Mm.
because Hong Kong was close to the border of Guangdong. Yeah, I just recall like, "Oh, there's no way we're going to let you through." And then suddenly they just said, "Okay, let them through. Don't bug anymore." So I don't know what happened there. Some instance like that, and maybe I wouldn't have any photos at all from those years if they hadn't done that. It's
Wow.
interesting. I never thought about that. Maybe that's a turning point for my career that they let me bring my film in,
Yeah.
which is pretty interesting. The thing about that also, I didn't develop it for the whole year and a half. How long my first trip to China was. I didn't develop the whole time. I could have had a scratch. I could have had a light leak. I could have had all kinds of problems. And I guess got lucky.
Mhm.
The whole batch of film, I think I lost one roll.
Wow.
And then I was talking about how like the Chinese film was no good at the time because I remember like one roll I had shot with Chinese film because I was like, oh, I'm going to try to conserve my Kodak film and use this Chinese film. I liked the pictures, but the grain was like little bubbles. But I found that after the fact because I just brought it all back to a darkroom in America and souped it all myself. But I was storing some in these fairly humid environments. So I'm amazed that I made it through. Yeah, that'd be terrifying right now if I did that. That's one, I guess, the advantage of digital,
Yeah.
which I guess was your second question when I switched to digital. Yeah,
Yeah.
probably around 2004.
Mm.
Digital was around before that, but I thought it would look terrible. I was kind of waiting because I had heard that Nikon was coming out with the D2X, and I was waiting for that camera to come
Mm.
out. But then I got an assignment. I think it was to shoot a so-called digital toothbrush. And for some reason, I needed a digital camera, maybe because they wanted it faster.
Mm.
And so I got this, I think a D70, which is pretty low, like a 6 megapixel camera.
Mhm.
And then like 2 months later, the D2X comes out. But yeah,
Interesting. What are you shooting with today?
I've got a Nikon Z7 II, which is not
Mm.
the top end camera, but it's good. It's better than anything I used before.
Mhm.
And it's nice to have a lighter camera.
Yeah. Has there ever been any Chinese cameras or lenses that you've used that you were impressed by?
I don't think I've ever even used one. I think I've held
Mm.
one. I think there were some knockoffs of maybe like the Zeiss twin lens reflex cameras.
Mhm.
There's a company, what, Seagull or something? There's some different companies that made this. They're cool to look at, but I wouldn't use them.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that's interesting about your work is most of your pictures are very wide angle.
Mm.
What focal length are you working with? And do you have any tips for composing images and working angles to avoid distortion?
The 28 was my go-to lens for most of my early years.
Mm-hmm.
And then over time, because if you're working on an assignment or working an event, you have to move fast. And so I switched to a 1735 zoom.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't bother me so much in the beginning, distortion. It didn't bother me, and then it bothers me more and more as I get older. And I still probably favor the wides, but I always try to go, as close to a 50 as possible these days when I'm shooting.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's the solution to avoid distortion. Also, with digital, you can chimp all the time. What you see is what you get.
Right.
And so I can look and see, okay, this person's arm looks enormous. It shouldn't be that enormous in this picture. So I back up or I change the angle. So it's mostly just kind of like feedback and experience as opposed to any specific tips. I mean, yeah, it's better to go less wide. It's something that does bother me though, like when I look at students' work, the students are always shooting with their phones
Yeah.
and they're shooting vertically with a point 0.5 on an iPhone, which sometimes it works. 99% of the time it doesn't. And so I guess that's the tip. If you're shooting wide, don't shoot vertical. That's a big tip, I guess.
Mm. So, in your book intro, you mentioned that during your first trip in 1989, locals told you you should be careful taking your camera out of your bag due to the presence of soldiers in the streets. Did you encounter problems when making pictures back then?
Well, after I first arrived in China, I just recall sometimes when people got mad at me for taking pictures. It might just been because I was in their faces, not speaking their language, and that's kind of fair enough. And I remember like
Hmm.
one time I ended up with my camera strap kind of wrapped around my neck, people dragging me off and screaming at me. And then because it was a novelty,
Huh.
I was the most entertaining thing happening, I guess, in that whole neighborhood because there's like 100 people around me, and then I don't know how I got out of that. It didn't typically happen. The reason I remember it so clearly is because it's one of the few times it happened.
Interesting. So, what's the situation when it comes to photographic restrictions in China today?
And just like what you can and can't photograph.
Yeah. Are there subjects or locations that people should be aware of that are off limits?
I think a lot of them are just kind of similar to what most places are.
In the West.
Yeah. These days, especially because everybody has a cell phone with a camera on it, that people are used to it. So
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that I found is that as opposed to can I take my photo in this situation, now one of the questions is can I take a photo of this event or the situation without getting a picture of somebody else taking the photo at the same time?
Right.
But then I think there was a sweet spot where that was like, oh, everybody's taking photos, all okay, to the point that people think, oh, basically my privacy is being invaded here. And that's kind of gone over that crest. And now we're going back down to people saying a little bit more private. Don't have your cell phone out. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
That happens here, I think, too, but also happens in China.
Would you say it's like the situation where if a crowd of people sees one person photographing, they're going to follow suit? And all of a sudden there's, 20 people taking the same picture?
I have to say, I'm also one of those followers sometimes too. And I bet you are too, right? Like, there's something interesting happening, you might take your camera out suddenly. If somebody's interested in something, I kind of want to know what it is too. And if it's interesting enough, I might follow suit and take my camera or my phone out
Mm-hmm.
and start photographing it as well. I've been photographing youth culture for many years. And some things I would do would be photographing rock concerts.
Mm-hmm.
And in America, if you were photographing like a club show where a band's playing, you don't get up on the stage and start photographing in the singer's face. You don't do that. And I saw that happen a lot in China. Some photographer would be standing the whole time for like a 5-minute song right up there. So you're watching the back of the photographer's head. So that shows like there are certain things that are much more open, right? That was early on when it was kind of a novelty, and now it's less so.
Interesting.
Yeah, I don't know if that happens now. I've saw that a lot. And I was like, yeah, I'm trying to take
Yeah.
a picture and I don't want this other photographer in the picture.
Getting in the way.
Yeah,
Yeah. What about cultural sensitivities when it comes to photographing people? Are there any rules of etiquette to consider?
Not much different from the West.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't spiritual beliefs about the camera, about taking pictures.
Right.
I think privacy is the stronger element. To be honest, when I started photographing in China, I did not necessarily get permission from people. I was just street shooting.
Mm-hmm.
And I would be more careful about that now. Partially because I've changed as a photographer, but also I think that people's awareness of their image is also changed. That could just end up somewhere that they don't want to end up.
Yeah. So do you have a favorite region in China for making pictures based on either the hospitality of the people or the beauty of the landscape?
I think the hospitality of the people is pretty good across China. I think partially because I first went there, I like the southwest part of China. the best, like Guangxi province or Yunnan province. I think those have a great landscape. China has a lot of minorities, and that's where they mostly are, that southwest part of China. You get the Han, which is the majority of Chinese are Han. I'm Han Chinese.
Hmm.
And then you have all these other kinds of cultures there too. And it's interesting to see the combination. And then there's also this wonderful landscape. You see the karst hills and mountains and incredible vegetation in these provinces. And so that's probably my favorite place to go. And then also I'm partial to Guangdong because that's where my family's from.
Right. Well, I think it's a good time for us to take a short break. When we return, we'll continue our conversation with Mark Leong about the people and culture of China. Stay tuned. I hope you're enjoying this chat with Mark Leong for my monthly series, Picturing World Cultures. Before we go back to the show, I want to give a shout out to Hannah B., who recently posted some helpful feedback about our past episodes to the comments section on the B&H Explora blog. When asked what she likes most about this series, she notes, it's photographers' personal stories. It's hearing different cultures, seeing all these images. Among her favorite shows are our chats with Taylor Irvine, Wayne Quilliam, and Daniel Rosca. Thanks so much for your engagement, Hannah. This feedback means a lot to us. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode and our show in general, and we welcome your ratings and reviews on our newest online destination, B&H Photo's YouTube channel, under the podcast tab. And stay tuned for my next installment of Picturing World Cultures coming up in December. Okay, we are back, and we're speaking with photographer Mark Leong about his documentation in China and his long-term project on China's youth culture. So, Mark, let's dive into your project, which is titled Coming of Age, China's Post-90s Generation, to document young adults born under China's one-child policy. But before we launch into your observations about this generation as they've reached adulthood, can you set the scene with some general background on this policy?
So China, for many years, was the most populous country in the world. In the 70s, it was reaching 1 billion people. It's surpassed that since then. And so there was worries of overpopulation and the ability to support that many people in China. So the government instituted this one-child policy where families could only have one kid. If you had twins, you're allowed to keep both, but otherwise you have one birth. And if you didn't comply, the child would not be registered, so couldn't go to school, probably couldn't go to the hospital. The parents would have fines, might not be able to hold public office. So there's a bunch of different penalties for having more than one child.
You started photographing young people in China well before 2018. What were your early impressions of the connection between parents and their little emperors as the single-child generation came to be known?
They're called that because they're the rulers of their family. And with one set of parents and two sets of grandparents for this one kid, they have 6 adults catering to them. And so they were thought of as these little rulers. And while I did see a sense of entitlement with all these people supporting them, just kind of this feeling that they were the center of the world in each of their families, I did a story about teenagers and middle schoolers, these so-called little emperors. And I talked to them, I guess it's late 90s, early 2000s. A lot of Chinese kids were also like highly educated in speaking English because everybody has learned English now in China because it's the international language. And I was just really impressed how together and sophisticated they were and forward-thinking they were. And yes, there was a sense of entitlement, but no more than my own kids, for example. It wasn't obnoxious. It was just very curious and interested and engaged. That's why I like this generation so much, because I feel, oh, this is China. If all these people were like these great kids, China's future looks really bright.
Interesting. So how closely connected are your pictures of the post-90s generation to your assignment work?
It started out as kind of like a seed assignment with National Geographic, but then because I stopped photographing during the pandemic, that just stopped. I would say it's not explicitly connected, although what I'm doing now in America, because I'm very interested in the Asian American population here. It's not the same project, but it does connect to stuff I'm doing where I'm looking at parts of the Asian American experience, especially among young people here. So it's not explicit, but it does inform that. And I'm interested in seeing how they're different.
Yeah. How they dovetail. Oh, that's
Yeah,
interesting.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So you lived in China until 2017, but you began this project in 2018 after you moved back to the States. So how much time have you typically spent in China since 2017?
I probably really started in 2017 because there's a couple of things I had photographed before I had kind of consolidated what I went to with the project.
Mm,
So from 2017 to the very end of 2019, when COVID had already hit China, I was often photographing in China. Basically, those 2.5 years where I was doing all the work.
hmm
Since then, I've kept in touch with my subjects, but I have not gone back to China because China just really reopened in the last year, I guess. I think some airports weren't open still for international travel.
From what I understand, in recent years, some of the traditional family structures in China have been disrupted due to a parent or half of a young married couple moving to a distant city for either jobs or schooling. Has that had a significant impact on the post 90s generation's development?
It seems like that's been going on for a while. I guess that does coincide because before China really opened up economically in 92, it was hard for people to go from their hometown to some other place.
Hmm.
So then in the 90s, migrant labor started happening. People began to leave the country to work. But I think what would happen is that they would often leave the kids with the grandparents. Or if they're in a village, there'd be like some groups of people to take care of the kids while everybody was gone working at the construction site 2 provinces over.
Right, right.
So I would think so, but more like a guess, right? I guess I do know people who are closer with their grandparents than their own parents by a lot.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's certainly an effect. And what that means long term, I'm not too sure.
Yeah, yeah. Do you know of families who had multiple children during the one child policy?
Well, I was just speaking with a Chinese friend who was in a family during the one child policy, post 90s, and she was born in 1996. And she had siblings born in 1995 and 1998. So there's a 3-kid family.
Mm,
She had told me kind of vaguely that she was raised by her grandmother, but I didn't realize how close the family were. I thought they had kind of like straddled the policy or something like that, but no, they were quite close in age and they just had them, I guess, within a matter of 4 years, they had 3 kids. And so I asked her how they did it. And she said that, well, basically, they were from Fujian province and their mother went out of the province to have the kids. And she
mhm,
didn't have them in the hospital. There's 2 girls she did not have in the hospital. So secret pregnancy delivered by a midwife, not in the hospital, not registered.
mhm,
One daughter went to the paternal grandfather and one daughter went to the maternal grandparents. So they're hidden
mm,
for like 5, 6 years. And then when the third kid is born, 2 years after the second daughter, it's a boy. And they keep him. And he's born in a hospital.
mm,
And
mhm,
so he's got it's called the hukou, which means like your local registration,
mhm,
which is attached
mhm,
to where you're born. They initially don't have the hukou. They're not registered. So her father, in order to register him, found loopholes by paying off officials
mhm,
to get registered so her and her sister would be able to go to school. Ultimately, they all moved to another province and they all finally, when my friend was 6 years old, the whole family got together.
mm.
But it was interesting because she's also talks about now how she's closer to her cousins
Huh,
than she is to her brother and sister because those bonding years when you're 4 or 5, 6 years old did not happen. And she feels that's part of it.
interesting.
Yeah.
And yeah, probably there was some trepidation about connecting with her siblings.
Or her parents. She's still angry about it.
Mm,
She felt abandoned. I mean, she
mhm,
described herself as abandoned, and she had never told me why, and now I know why. So this clever workaround and resourcefulness, there's personal cost to it.
cool. So, in a statement about your project, you write, "What happens in a society built on 4,000 years of traditional clan connections where brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, and cousins abruptly go missing. Based on everything you've seen and the information you've gathered so far, what's your best guess at a response to that?
Yeah, it's definitely a guess because the point of my project now is that these people are coming of age. And so, how that plays out in the next generation when they have kids, what's going to happen with that? But I guess the stuff you see right now, the gender gap, a lot more males than females.
Hmm.
I think it's like 115 boys to every 100 girls. There's also the idea of elderly care, and we're seeing that now as their parents get older. And in the past, most of the elderly care was done within the family. And so, what's going to happen when you only have one kid? When the kid's still trying to support their own family and have a business, and also they're going to be taking care of the parents and possibly the grandparents too. So, what's going to happen there? That could also be more broadly applied in terms of just the idea of pressure. This is something happening now. I talked to some young people I know, this one child generation, and they're talking about how if the parents have dreams, like they want their kid to be an engineer and they have three kids, well, then only one kid has to be an engineer and they're all good, right?
Hmm.
But when they have all their dreams onto this one kid, the kid has to do all the things like be an engineer, get married early, perhaps move nearby to them so they can take care of all these pressures. It's not spread out. It's all just one point.
Mm.
You're the point of support where everybody wants to support you and give stuff to you and dote on you as a kid. But then you're also the point where everybody expects stuff from you at the same time.
Right.
That's part of the current mindset, I think, of a lot of these post 90s single children.
Yeah. So China is traditionally known as a patriarchal society.
Hmm.
Has there been much of a shift in that kind of social structure within the post-90s generation that you know of?
As a photographer, I'm more of an observer, and a lot of it's anecdotal and people I talk to as opposed to having studied this. But like the Me Too movement has hit China. And so there's more strength among women to stand up for what they want
Mm.
and
Hmm.
what they need. But it's really a Confucian society, which is a male dominant society, and that's hard to shake.
Hmm.
So I think it's still male bias. I mean, just the story about how a family will send off their two daughters to live with other people while they keep their son. That happened in the 90s, but that seems to be still part of the equation.
Right. What about the familial pressure for Chinese youth to marry young? There's at least one statistic I read that notes that this has been cut in half over the past 10 years. Is there still such a thing as arranged marriages or matchmakers or dowries that young adults have to contend with today?
From what I've seen, people are waiting to get married. Maybe not to the level of America, but it's later. People can wait till their 30s to get married.
Mm.
I think that families have pressure, but there's also you've raised this kid to be an individual,
Hmm.
and the individual says, "I'm not going to necessarily do that." I might hang out and take care of my parents, but I'm not necessarily going to get married early because I don't want to be tied up to that at this point.
Hmm.
The place where you see the matchmakers is actually because of the one child policy, where it's more favored to having boys than having girls.
Hmm.
So you see the matchmaking, but that's maybe more from desperation for parents who want to find somebody for their boy.
Right.
These kind of marriage markets they have. There's been a lot of media coverage about these places. I don't think it's a real common thing to be matchmaked, especially this young generation. They are more independent in some ways, and that would be one way, like find their own partners.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned something about individualism.
Mm.
Do you feel like that has become a tenet within society for young people to be raised as individuals?
People are more trying to say what's different about them. Kind of like my own kids, but a Chinese version of that. I mean, the obvious way as a photographer to see this is people willing to dress away or get certain kind of tattoos and these things, which are just very unique, not trying to blend in with everybody else. When I first came to China, everybody was kind of blended in together. And maybe it's because I was not looking carefully enough, but it was like superficial stuff like what you wear.
Right.
Everybody's wearing the same exact colored jacket, the same green jacket, the same black pants.
Yeah. Well, there was less choice for one thing.
Yeah, less choice. And yeah, exactly. But less way to express yourself.
Hmm.
And so I think people feel much more free to express themselves. And you see this also in like social media. People are willing to stand out and try to be a star.
Hmm.
And I don't think that was much the case before. Just
Mhm.
to lie low and be a cog seemed to be more of the way of thinking.
Right. So you spent a lot of time photographing in Shenzhen, which you refer to as China's most youthful city. And I'm sure much of the draw to that city is for manufacturing jobs. But are there other, perhaps cultural aspects of Shenzhen that make it appealing to Chinese youth?
Shenzhen is kind of a melting pot city because of all these jobs.
Mm.
And so all these young people will go there looking for work. And sometimes they're not just what we think of as a typical migrant worker. They have college degrees. Some of them have master's degrees. They're getting jobs in industrial design or in IT. And so that's why it feels like this kind of place you can start anew, I guess.
Mhm.
And so I guess that's part of the attraction. And then it seems planned because they were able to start from kind of the bare bones of just like a fishing village to make it into this metropolis. And so they were able to, instead of have to deal with old traditional parts of the city that they want to change, they just could do whatever they wanted. So you see these kind of nice parks, and you think, oh, Shenzhen's the factory town, and it's this place where it's going to be all like boring and smoggy. And there are parts that are like that, let's be honest, but there are also parts that are pretty livable. I was always surprised by that when I went down there to do a story, to go see some factory. There, yeah, there's factory districts, but there's also these parts that seem like, yeah, this is just like a modern city.
Mhm. And it didn't have to shift from the old
Yeah,
feudal ways to a contemporary city.
yeah.
One of your image captions notes that young Chinese have an immediate desire to monetize their hobbies. Can you elaborate further about that?
Yeah, I don't think all of them do, but I just noticed in certain situations. I guess the first time it really struck me and I kind of thought about it was when I was in some place where there was mountain bike tours. And I signed up to rent a mountain bike, and the person who was running it, I said, "Oh, this is cool. Like, when did your business start?" And they're like, "We were here last fall, and we really enjoyed mountain biking, and we decided we are going to open this company." It was just like in a matter of a few months, they opened a company, something that they started learning to themselves.
Uh-huh.
So that's the first time I saw it. Then I've seen it after with like rock climbing or like guitar shops. I think the picture you're mentioning is like a vape shop. And so, yeah, these people learn to blow smoke rings. And I think because when a young Chinese person is interested in a hobby, it might not be the easiest thing to get the gear you need for that hobby. So once you develop the channels to get that gear, you may realize that there's a empty spot in the marketplace
Hmm.
for this thing that you can provide and you know how to do because you've done it for yourself. And so why not make money and help other people like you? And you're also aware of the community of people who want to do this thing,
Right,
whatever it
right.
is, rock climbing, vaping, because I think China from the 90s onwards, there's a lot of stuff that existed in other parts of the world that people really wanted to have, but it wasn't quite there yet. And so people said, hey, I can do that. I mean, I think that's how like lots of the Chinese IT industry started. It's like, okay, there are these, YouTube or whatever, and let's just do our version of that. And so I think that's partially what happened there in terms of entrepreneurship.
Yeah, so would you compare it to, like, what's happening in America with influencers, influencer culture?
I guess so. Although, as far as I've observed, I thought the influencer culture was in China before it was in US, right? TikTok is from Douyin, which was the original version in China. And then it
Mhm.
became TikTok and it got internationalized a couple of years later. So I saw that stuff that was happening in China before I saw it in the US, live streaming and doing these short videos.
Mhm.
I guess it's similar though, because you do what you love and you monetize it. But I think the monetizing in China is not just like showing people or teaching; it's like selling stuff too.
Right.
Just something I've observed more than once, like a lot of times, because I'm interested in hobby stuff too. So I want to get some kind of gear of some sort, like coffee making, or getting a coffee grinder. I remember that, and then I found this whole coffee grinding underground in China. And now it's so big that it's no longer an open market. After a certain point, when everybody starts doing it, or if it's very popular, then it's over, and then you're not going to be able to make money doing that.
Right.
Yeah,
It's reached saturation
yeah,
point.
yeah,
So it's a matter of jumping in early.
yeah.
What about young people looking back to traditional culture? Is there any interest in China's past cultural heritage? or are they charting a new course?
I think both. There's a lot of pride in the past.
Mhm.
China was the height of civilization, the Tang Dynasty say. So there's a lot of pride in that. And you see in stuff like there's the Hanfu movement,
Hmm.
which is kind of a response to cosplay. So cosplay is dressing up as Japanese anime characters,
Right,
basically.
right. Mhm.
And then Hanfu is dressing up as figures from the legends and myths of China.
Mhm.
And that's kind of a response like, yes, we have this background too. We have this culture in China too. I mean, I know artists who are trying to do traditional calligraphy, but in their own way, in this kind of avant garde way.
Mm.
And you see video games like the Legends of the Monkey King or Three Kingdoms. These are kind of traditional stories.
Mhm.
And so I think that this is an opportunity because there's more resources to actually come up with a kind of a modern identity. There's been creative people, but it's not valued in the way that creates something that's identifiably Chinese. Like, 'cause most of the stuff that we see in the West about China is ancient culture. We think of China, we think of older stuff,
Mhm.
centuries old stuff. While it seems like this generation wants to do more like in areas of design or the areas of software or video games that aren't based on ancient Chinese stories.
Mhm.
I feel
Mhm.
that that's coming out. So that's what's interesting also to me about this generation I'm photographing, that they have this kind of creativity and they have the resources to use this creativity to make something.
And how much of that kind of information did you learn during the time period when you had to stop photographing because of COVID, but you kept up a correspondence?
I think a fair amount of that then, but also just talking throughout this whole project, not just during the COVID time, but seeing what people think. Because there's a lot of time just spent just chatting, sitting around, just talking,
Mhm.
because I'm trying to figure out how to do a photo or what the story is. Why are they involved in these activities? Why do they have this job? What they expect to do? So that kind of stuff comes out when we're talking about their own lives.
So, along with photographing these young adults in China, you're leading photo workshops about identity and community with American college students. And you mentioned that you're very interested in looking at Asian American communities. So, based on that, are there any cultural differences that you find between young adults in China and America?
There's certainly deep cultural differences, like the Confucian culture, growing up in a socialist society versus growing up in a capitalist society. That said, they're rapidly converging. You talk about the same things now. You
Hmm.
know, I think there are different circumstances, like the economy, right? A lot of how you feel and your positivity or pessimism is based on your economy. And they're both going these kind of waves, like in America and in China, it's like these kind of waves up and down, like kind of responding to different things. But I feel it's somewhat similar
Hmm.
to the way people are acting.
What influence do you think increasing globalization has on the behaviors and the worldviews of these two groups of young adults?
Yeah, because we end up seeing kind of the same stuff, right?
Mhm.
Listening to the same music,
Mm.
watching the same movies, reading the same novels. And, there are differences and like certain things can't be seen in different places, but um, it's still more common ground, I think, between
Mm.
Chinese and American young people.
Yeah. Are you doing anything with the students that you're working with in the US to connect them?
Not at this time because the current workshop I just finished teaching is not about Asian or Chinese,
Mm, mhm,
just more about generally self care.
mhm.
So within their lives, we show care for each other and how we heal ourselves and each other in our lives. But I'm interested in doing that. Like we have talked about, and this is at UC Irvine, and we've talked about doing projects which are also kind of bridging between Americans and Chinese. That's going to be very interesting.
Yeah.
The idea is to have a group of young photographers in America with a group of young photographers in China and having them kind of guide each other through their projects, kind of exchange programs and have different perspectives on the same things. That's on the drawing board. We don't know if that's going
Mhm.
to happen.
Yeah, I think would be very worthwhile, very
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, because to have somebody who's local help you do a project is way different from having somebody who's just kind of parachuting in like I did. I just parachuted in, but having somebody local there makes a big difference. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, I look forward to seeing or in learning more.
Yeah, I'll let you know if that goes through, if we can get
Yeah.
that together. Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks so much, Mark, for your time and speaking with me today and the insights you've shared about Chinese culture and your documentation of contemporary life there. But before we go, I'd like to end with a short visual questionnaire inspired by the TV show Inside the Actors Studio. It's a brief list of questions with one-sentence answers. So, Mark Leong, with all things being equal, is your preference color or black and white?
Oh, these are really hard questions. I say color because I'm still working at it.
Mm-hmm. So which image orientation do you gravitate to more often, horizontal, vertical, or square?
Oh, it's horizontal for sure. But, even though I try to avoid the wides, I still end
Mm-hmm.
up kind of going towards the wides. So I definitely like horizontal.
Yeah, yeah. And what's your lens preference, prime or zoom?
Zoom gives me more options.
Mm-hmm. If you could only carry one lens, which would it be?
I'm currently carrying a 24-70, and I kind of like that.
Yeah, it covers all the bases.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not really an answer.
What one photographer, living or dead, has influenced your work the most?
I guess Robert Frank.
Mm-hmm. And outside of photography, what profession or craft would you most like to explore?
Cooking.
Ooh.
Making food. Some food thing.
Uh-huh.
Probably cooking.
Yum. In a single word, what's your biggest motivation for making pictures?
Seeking.
That's a nice word. I like that. So you recently received fiscal sponsorship for your post-90s generation project. What do you have on tap for that project, or do you have any other projects you're working on?
So I started photographing these Asian American kind of projects. I was trying to find places in California where a strong part of the Asian American community was involved.
Mm-hmm.
So I was photographing a lot of STEM programs, actually. But that's just the start. So I'm trying to figure out different ways to approach this kind of question.
Mm-hmm.
And also have some energy projects about environmental energy that I'm working on. But I think the main thing I am trying to focus on will be to follow up with my China Youth Project.
Mm-hmm.
That's what this fiscal sponsorship is for.
Yeah. Any plans to go back to China?
I'm trying to. Once I can get my budget together, I will go. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. And where can guests find out more about you and your work?
There's my website, markleongphotography.com. If you want to see some pictures from the Youth Coming of Age Project, that's centersantafe.org/coming of age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's a really nice summary and beautiful pictures that you have there. Yeah. So those links will be in our show notes.
Okay, great.
So Mark Leong, thanks again for joining us today and for your passion for telling authentic stories about Chinese culture.
Oh, it's been great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure to speak with you. And to our listeners, if you enjoyed today's show, we'd love to hear about it. Pull up this episode on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, B&H's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave us a comment. While you're there, make sure that subscribe button is clicked for automatic updates about every episode release. You can also find us and drop us a line on the Explora blog, where we post photos from our guests along with the show notes. And if you're a fan of social media, please join us on Facebook at the B&H Photography Podcast group, where you can share your favorite photos and comment about the show. I'm Jill Waterman, the podcast creative producer and host of this series. Episodes are recorded, mixed, and edited by technical producer Mike Weinstein. Theme music for this series is composed by Gabriel Richards, and our executive producer is Richard Stevens. On behalf of us all, thank you so much for listening.